Before we step into the freezing winds of the Montana wilderness to witness a miracle of survival, take a moment to pause. If you believe that the connection between a human soul and a wild heart is one of the purest forces on this earth, and if you want to support more stories that celebrate this unspoken language, please consider subscribing to the channel. Like this video to help spread the warmth, leave a comment about your own animal companions, and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey of survival and love. Now, let us walk into the snow. The snow was no longer white. It was a map of agony, a trail of crimson droplets that marred the pristine moonlit blanket of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. The wind howled through the canyons like a grieving mother, carrying with it the biting cold that usually signaled death for anything foolish enough to be caught unprotected. But the creature moving through this frozen hell was not foolish. He was desperate. He was a young gray wolf, barely 7 months old, caught in the awkward, gangly stage between pup and predator, and he was dying. He had been running for hours. To be precise, his journey had begun 42 kilometers to the north, in a valley that had been turned into a slaughterhouse by a rival pack. His lungs burned with a fire that felt hotter than the blood freezing on his fur. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass in his chest. His paws, designed by evolution to traverse ice and stone, were now raw meat. The pads had been sliced open by the sharp shale of the ridgeline he had been forced to cross to escape the massacre. He left a bloody print with every step, a rhythmic testament to a will to survive that defied biological explanation. Most animals, when wounded this severely, would curl up under the shelter of a spruce tree and let the hypothermia take them. It is a gentle death, a drifting into sleep. But this wolf, whom the forest seemed to watch with bated breath, did not stop. He was driven by an instinct that transcended mere survival. It was a pull, a magnetic draw toward a specific coordinate in this vast, indifferent landscape. He was running toward a memory, or perhaps a scent, that promised the only thing he had never truly known: safety. The distance he had covered was impossible. 42 kilometers on bleeding paws, with a gash on his flank from an elder wolf's fang that wept dark fluid down his leg. His vision was tunneling, the edges of the world turning gray and fuzzy. The towering pines of Montana were no longer distinct trees, but blurring shadows that reached out to grab him. He stumbled, his snout plowing into a drift, the cold shock momentarily reviving him. He pushed himself up, his legs trembling so violently they looked like dry twigs in a gale. He whined, a sound so low and broken it was swallowed instantly by the wind. Just a little farther, the instinct screamed in his blood, the scent of wood smoke, the scent of the tall one. He dragged himself over the final rise. Below, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by sentinels of lodgepole pine, sat a cabin. It was a humble structure of rough-hewn logs, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney, defying the storm. To the wolf, it looked like a star fallen to earth. He didn't have the strength to run anymore. He didn't even have the strength to walk. He let gravity take him, sliding and stumbling down the slope, his body a dead weight against the snow. He reached the bottom and clawed his way toward the wooden steps of the porch. He tried to climb, one paw, two. His hind legs gave out, and he collapsed, his chin striking the frozen wood of the bottom step with a hollow thud. He let out one final sharp exhale, the air leaving his lungs in a cloud of steam that lingered for a second before vanishing. His eyes, the color of burnt amber, rolled back. The darkness took him. Elias Thorne was not a man who expected visitors. In fact, he had spent the last 5 years of his life ensuring he wouldn't have any. At 52, he wore his isolation like a heavy coat, comfortable but weighing him down. He sat in his leather armchair, a book resting forgotten on his knee, listening to the symphony of the storm battering his sanctuary. The fire in the hearth popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, casting dancing shadows against the walls lined with topographical maps and sketches of local fauna. Elias was a man of science, formerly one of the state's leading wildlife biologists, a man who had spent decades tracking, collaring, and studying the very creatures that now roamed the darkness outside his window. But facts and data couldn't fix a broken heart, and they certainly couldn't bring back the dead. So he had retreated here to the edge of the world to live out his days in a silence that he told himself was peace, though he knew it was merely numbness. He heard the thud. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. The timbre was different, softer, heavier. It was the sound of a body hitting wood. Elias froze, his instincts, sharpened by 30 years in the field, instantly on high alert. He set the book down and reached for the flashlight he kept on the mantel, his hand brushing past the loaded rifle he kept for bears. He didn't take the gun. If it was a person, they needed help. If it was an animal, it was likely dying. He opened the heavy oak door, and the wind immediately assaulted him, throwing a handful of snow into his bearded face. He squinted against the gale, sweeping the beam of the flashlight across the porch. The light cut through the swirling white and landed on a dark, matted heap at the foot of the stairs. "What in God's name?" Elias muttered, his voice rough from disuse. He stepped out, the cold instantly penetrating his flannel shirt. He moved down the stairs, crouching beside the form. At first, he thought it was a large coyote, or perhaps a stray dog from the ranches 20 miles south. But when he touched the fur, coarse and thick, and saw the size of the paws, he knew. "Wolf," he whispered, a shock of adrenaline piercing his calm. He shone the light over the animal. The condition of the creature hit him like a physical blow. The wolf was emaciated, its ribs visible even through the winter coat, but it was the blood that made Elias's stomach turn. The paws were shredded, raw meat exposed to the ice. A deep, ugly gash ran along the right flank, infected and oozing. The animal wasn't moving. It wasn't shivering. That was a bad sign. It meant the body had given up trying to generate heat. Elias checked for a heartbeat. He pressed his hand deep into the fur behind the elbow. For a long second he felt nothing. Then a faint, thready thump, thump. It was a slow rhythm, a fading drumbeat. "Not on my porch," Elias growled, a sudden fierce determination taking hold of him. He hadn't cared about much in years, but he could not stand by and watch a magnificent creature fade into oblivion on his doorstep. He scooped the wolf up. The animal was surprisingly heavy, dead weight in his arms, but Elias was strong, his muscles hardened by a life of chopping wood and hauling water. He grunted with the effort, carrying the limp body up the stairs and into the cabin. He kicked the door shut behind him, cutting off the wind scream, replacing it with the crackle of the fire. He laid the wolf on the rug before the hearth, but not too close. Warming a hypothermic body too fast could send it into shock and stop the heart. He moved with the precision of the scientist he used to be. He grabbed blankets, towels, his medical kit, and a bowl of warm water. As the firelight illuminated the wolf's face, Elias paused. He recognized the markings, the dark saddleback pattern, the notch in the left ear. He had seen this wolf before months ago, through the lens of a spotting scope miles away. This was a pup from the Silver Creek Pack, but the Silver Creek Pack was located in the northern valley, on the other side of the treacherous Switchback Ridge. Elias looked at the shredded paws. He looked at the map on his wall. He did the mental calculation instantly. 40 kilometers, he whispered, staring at the unconscious animal. "You ran 40 kilometers, over the ridge, in this storm." The impossibility of the feat silenced him. Why? Why run south? Why come here? Wolves avoided human structures like the plague. To come to a cabin meant desperation beyond measure, or intent. Elias shook his head, pushing the questions away. He needed to work. He started with the paws. He soaked a cloth in warm saline and began to gently dab away the frozen blood and grit. The wolf didn't flinch. He was too far gone. Elias worked for an hour, cleaning the wounds, applying antibiotic ointment, and wrapping the paws in light gauze to protect them. He stitched the gash on the flank, 8 stitches, performed with steady hands that remembered the anatomy of 1,000 animals. The smell of wet fur, copper blood, and antiseptic filled the small cabin. It was a scent that triggered a cascade of memories for Elias. Field hospitals, tagging operations, the time he and his wife Sarah had nursed a fawn back to health in their garage. The memory of Sarah brought a sharp pang to his chest, familiar and dull. She had loved this. She had loved the broken things. "You fix the body, Eli," she would say. "I'll fix the spirit." "I'm just fixing the body, Sarah," he murmured to the empty room. "That's all I can do." He checked the wolf's temperature. It was rising, but slowly. The animal needed fluids. Elias mixed a solution of water and sugar, grabbed a syringe, and carefully trickled small amounts into the side of the wolf's mouth, massaging the throat to encourage swallowing. The wolf coughed weakly, a good sign, and swallowed. For the next 6 hours, Elias didn't sleep. He sat on the floor beside the rug, feeding the fire, monitoring the wolf's breathing. He watched the rise and fall of the chest, terrified that each breath would be the last. The storm outside raged on, burying the cabin in silence, but inside, a strange intimacy was forming. 2 isolated beings trapped in a bubble of light and warmth. Around 4 a.m., the rhythm of the wolf's breathing changed. It deepened. The rapid, shallow panting of shock gave way to the steady draw of sleep. The shivering began, a violent, full-body tremor. Elias knew this was actually good. It meant the body was fighting to warm itself. He piled another blanket on the wolf, tucking it in tight. "Fight it," Elias whispered, his hand resting on the wolf's neck. "You didn't run a marathon just to die on a rug." Elias must have dozed off, his head resting against the seat of his armchair. He was awoken by a sound, a low, guttural growl. He opened his eyes instantly. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow across the room. The wolf was awake. The animal had lifted its head. Its ears were pinned back, teeth bared in a snarl of fear and confusion. He tried to scramble up, but his bandaged paws slid on the wooden floor, and his weakness betrayed him. He collapsed back down, panting, his golden eyes locked onto Elias. Elias didn't move a muscle. He knew that to move now was to trigger a prey response or a defensive attack. He kept his posture low, his eyes averted slightly to show he wasn't challenging. "Easy," Elias said, his voice a low rumble, calm and steady. "Easy now, you're safe." The wolf watched him. The intelligence in those eyes was piercing. This wasn't a dog looking for a master. This was a wild, apex predator assessing a threat. But beneath the aggression, Elias saw the terror. The wolf was a child, alone, in pain, in an alien world. "I know," Elias continued, keeping his voice a hypnotic drone. "I know it hurts. You came a long way. You're at the cabin. You remember the cabin. You smelled the smoke." The wolf's growl subsided into a whimper. He sniffed the air, smelling the antiseptic, the fire, and the man. He seemed to be processing the data. He looked at his bandaged paws. He looked back at Elias. Then something happened that Elias had never seen in 30 years of working with wolves. The wolf let out a long sigh, the tension leaving his frame. He lowered his head back onto his paws, but he didn't close his eyes. He kept them fixed on Elias, not with aggression, but with a profound, exhausted curiosity. It was a look of assessment, of weighing the soul of the creature sitting across from him. Elias felt a strange tightening in his throat. He reached out a hand, palm up, stopping 2 feet from the wolf's nose. He waited. Minutes passed. The embers cracked. Slowly, painfully, the wolf stretched his neck forward. He sniffed Elias's fingers. The nose was cold and wet. He took a scent, memorizing the man. Then the wolf did not pull away. He rested his chin on the floor, just inches from Elias's hand, and closed his eyes. "Okay," Elias whispered, a tear he hadn't authorized leaking from the corner of his eye. "Okay, We'll call you Coda. It means friend in the old tongue, but for now, just rest, Coda." Elias leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. He had saved the wolf's life tonight, but as he watched the sleeping form, the rise and fall of the flank, Elias had the strange, unsettling feeling that the transaction wasn't entirely one-sided. The silence in the cabin didn't feel so heavy anymore. The ghost of his loneliness had been pushed back into the shadows, kept at bay by the heartbeat of a wolf who had run through hell just to find a place to rest his head. But the morning would bring new challenges. A wolf does not leave his pack without a reason, and whatever had driven Coda 42 kilometers south, whatever horror had stained the snow red in that northern valley, was likely not finished. And Elias, the man who wanted nothing to do with the world, had just made himself a part of it again. The days that followed were a study in the geometry of trust. The cabin, once a vessel of solitude, became a den of cautious negotiation. For the first week, Coda did not move from the rug in front of the hearth. He lay there like a dethroned king, his golden eyes tracking Elias's every movement with a predatory intensity that was unnerving. Elias knew that he was not living with a dog. There was no tail wagging, no eager whining for affection. There was only the heavy, watchful silence of a creature that calculated the caloric cost of every blink. Elias moved with deliberate slowness. He knew that to a wild animal, speed was synonymous with violence. When he chopped vegetables for his stew, he did so with a steady, rhythmic cadence. When he added logs to the fire, he announced his actions with a soft murmur. He became a narrator of his own life, speaking to the wolf in a low, gravelly monologue about the weather, the density of the snowpack, and the history of the tectonic plates beneath their feet. Barometric pressure is dropping again, Coda," Elias muttered on the fourth day, glancing at the brass instrument on the wall while stirring a pot of oatmeal. "Means another front is pushing in from the Canadian Shield. More snow. Good for the water table, bad for the deer." Coda's ear flicked, a subtle swivel of the cartilage that Elias, with his trained eye, recognized as an acknowledgement. It wasn't friendship yet. It was data processing. The wolf was learning the sounds of safety. The healing process was grueling. The infection in Coda's flank required daily cleaning, a procedure that was a high-stakes gamble every time. The first time Elias reached for the wound with a fresh saline compress, Coda had snapped, a lightning-fast display of white fangs that stopped mere millimeters from Elias's wrist. It was a warning shot. Elias hadn't pulled back. He hadn't flinched. He had simply frozen, holding the wolf's gaze, projecting a calm dominance. "I know," he had whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "It burns, but the rot is worse than the sting. We do this, or you lose the leg." Slowly, the snarl had dissolved into a reluctant submission. Coda had laid his head back down, letting out a huff of resignation. It was a victory of will, a silent agreement that pain was a necessary currency for survival. As the weeks bled into a month, the physical wounds began to knit together. The angry red of the gash faded to a jagged pink scar, a map of the battle Coda had survived. His paws, once raw meat, hardened with new calluses. But as the wolf grew stronger, Elias noticed a different kind of wound, one that no antibiotic could touch. It happened usually at twilight, the wolf hour, when the light turned blue and the shadows stretched long across the snow. Coda would limp to the window, pressing his nose against the cold glass, and stare north. He would let out a sound that wasn't quite a howl, but a mourning song, a low, rising keening that vibrated in the floorboards. It was the sound of exile. One evening, as Coda stood his vigil at the window, Elias sat in his armchair, a glass of whiskey resting on his knee, the amber liquid catching the firelight. The sound of Coda's grief pulled a thread loose in Elias's own mind, unspooling a memory he usually kept tightly wound. Flashback. 5 years ago, the sterile smell of the hospital room in Bozeman, a sharp contrast to the pine and earth scent of their lives. Sarah lay in the bed, her body a pale imitation of the vibrant woman who had once hiked the Continental Divide with a 40-pound pack. The cancer had been a wildfire, consuming her with terrifying speed. "Don't go back to the dark, Eli," she had whispered, her hand frail in his. Her eyes, usually bright with mischief, were clouded with pain. "Promise me, you go back to the woods, but don't shut the door. The world is still beautiful, even if I'm not in it to tell you so." "I can't do the beauty without you, Sarah," Elias had choked out, the sobbing wreck of a man who had thought he was strong enough to wrestle grizzlies, but wasn't strong enough to watch his wife die. "You have to," she said, squeezing his hand with the last of her strength. "Find something to save. If you can't save me, save something else. That's how you stay alive." She died 2 hours later, as the sun rose over the Bridger Mountains. Elias had buried her, packed his truck, and driven to the cabin, locking the door not just against the elements, but against the possibility of ever feeling that kind of loss again. He had failed to keep his promise. He had shut the door. Present day. Elias took a sip of the whiskey, the burn grounding him. He looked at the wolf. "I know what it's like," he said softly. Coda's ears swiveled back toward him, though he didn't turn his head. "To look for something that isn't there anymore. To feel like half a creature." Coda turned then, limping away from the window. He moved to Elias's chair. For the first time, he didn't lie on the rug. He sat on his haunches, his head level with Elias's chest, and looked him in the eye. The barrier between species seemed to thin. In that moment, they weren't man and wolf. They were two widowers sharing a silent toast to the ghosts they couldn't leave behind. Coda nudged Elias's hand with his wet nose. The contact was electric. Elias slowly uncurled his fingers and buried them in the thick ruff of fur around the wolf's neck. Coda leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. It was the first time in 5 years Elias had touched another living being with affection. The ice around his heart cracked, just a hairline fracture, but it was enough to let the light in. By the 6th week, Coda was restless. The cabin was too small for a recovering apex predator. It was time for the test. The morning was crisp, the sky a piercing cloudless blue that hurt the eyes. Elias put on his parka, grabbed his rifle, more out of habit than intent, and opened the heavy oak door. He stepped out onto the porch and waited. Coda stood in the doorway. He sniffed the wind, his nostrils flaring, taking in the encyclopedia of scents that the breeze carried. Pine resin, decay, snowshoe hair, distant elk. He looked at the open wilderness, then back at Elias. "Go on," Elias said, gesturing to the trees. "You're free. If you want to go north, go. I won't stop you." This was the moment of truth. Biologically, a healed wolf should bolt. The instinct to find a new territory, to find a mate, to run, should be overwhelming. Coda stepped onto the snow. He took a few steps, his gait slightly uneven, but strong. He walked to the edge of the clearing, marked a sapling, and looked toward the tree line. He stood there for a long minute, a silhouette of wild power against the white backdrop. Elias held his breath, a sudden, sharp pang of preemptive loneliness hitting him. He's leaving. Of course he's leaving. Then Coda turned. He looked at the trees, then looked at Elias. With a decisive huff, he trotted back toward the cabin, circled Elias once, and sat down at his feet, facing outward. He was standing guard. "Well," Elias exhaled, a smile breaking through his beard, "I guess I'm the pack now." Life fell into a rhythm that was ancient and new. They began to roam together, Elias on his snowshoes, Coda breaking trail ahead. Elias observed the wolf's behavior with the fascination of a scientist and the pride of a father. He watched how Coda navigated the terrain, how he used the wind, but he also saw the trauma. Coda was hypervigilant. He didn't just watch the woods. He scanned them for specific threats. He was terrified of the north. One afternoon, while checking a line of camera traps Elias used for his research, he was still collecting data, even if he never published it. They ventured further than usual, about 5 miles from the cabin, into a dense ravine known as Dead Man's Drop. The snow here was deep and unstable. Elias was focused on a memory card swap, his gloves off for dexterity, cursing the cold. Coda was pacing nearby, agitated. He kept stopping, lifting a paw and chuffing, a sharp, explosive sound of warning. "Quiet, Coda, I'm almost done," Elias muttered, fiddling with the small plastic latch. Coda didn't quiet down. He barked, a rare, harsh sound, and then physically slammed his body into Elias's legs, nearly knocking the man over. "Hey, what is with you?" Elias snapped, looking down. Then he heard it, the crack. It wasn't a branch. It was the sound of the snowpack fracturing above them. A cornice of wind-hardened snow hanging off the lip of the ravine 100 feet up had given way. Elias looked up to see a wall of white descending. He had seconds. He couldn't outrun it. Coda didn't run away. He ran at Elias. The wolf bit down on the sleeve of Elias's parka and yanked with the strength of a draft horse. The force of the pull threw Elias off balance, dragging him 5 feet to the right, behind the shelter of a massive, overturned boulder. The avalanche hit. The world turned into a roaring, suffocating whiteness. The noise was deafening, a freight train made of ice. Elias curled into a ball, covering his head, feeling the ground shake as tons of snow slammed into the ravine floor. The boulder diverted the main flow, but the backwash buried him. Darkness swallowed him whole. Silence returned, instant and absolute. Elias was pinned. He couldn't move his legs. The snow was packed tight around him like concrete. He was in an air pocket created by the overhang of the boulder, but it was small. Panic, the cold reptilian brain response, tried to seize him. "I'm going to die here, buried alive." "Coda," he rasped. The air in the pocket was thin. He heard scratching, frantic, desperate digging. Above him, the snow shifted. A shaft of light pierced the gloom. Then a black nose broke through, followed by a golden eye. Coda whined, digging furiously with his healed paws, ignoring the pain that must have been shooting through his recovering pads. He bit at the snow, pulling it away in chunks. Within minutes, he had cleared enough space for Elias to wiggle his arms free. Elias gasped, sucking in the cold, sweet air. He reached up and grabbed the wolf's ruff. "Good boy," he choked out, his voice trembling. "Good boy." It took them another hour to dig Elias completely out. When they finally sat on the debris field, exhausted and shivering, the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Elias had saved Coda from the cold death of the porch. Coda had saved Elias from the white death of the avalanche. The ledger was balanced. They were no longer just companions. They were bound by the blood debt of the wild. But the wilderness gives with one hand and takes with the other. As they made their way back to the cabin, limping and bruised, the wind shifted. It began to blow from the north. Coda froze. The hackles on his back stood up in a rigid ridge of fur. He bared his teeth, a low, vibrating growl emanating from his chest that was deeper and more primal than anything Elias had heard before. Elias stopped. He smelled it too. It was a musk, heavy and pungent, the scent of a pack. He looked at the snow near the cabin's perimeter. There, crossing their earlier tracks, were prints. Huge prints, much larger than Coda's. Elias knelt to examine them. He measured the stride. "Timber wolves," he whispered. "Large males." He stood up, his hand drifting to the knife at his belt. The tracks circled the cabin and then led off into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. But they weren't just passing through. They had stopped. They had marked the corners of the cabin. They were testing the defenses. Coda was trembling, not from cold, but from a rage mixed with terror. He knew who made these tracks. The slaughterhouse in the valley hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been a purge, and the executioners had realized that one of their victims had escaped. They hadn't just found a cabin, they had found the scent of the survivor. Elias looked at Coda, then at the darkening woods. The isolation he had cherished was gone. The silence was over. War had come to the sanctuary. "Let's get inside," Elias said, his voice hard. He ushered Coda onto the porch and bolted the heavy door behind them. He went to the gun cabinet and unlocked it. taking out the box of ammunition he hadn't touched in years. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a sound that chilled the blood in Elias's veins. It was a howl rising from the north ridge. It wasn't the mournful song of a lone wolf. It was a chorus, a hunting cry, and it was getting closer. The siege did not begin with teeth. It began with silence. After that initial bone-chilling chorus, the forest fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet. It was a psychological tactic, one Elias knew well from his studies. An apex predator does not announce its final approach. It lets the fear do the work first. It lets the prey exhaust itself with anticipation. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of gun oil and pine pitch. Elias had boarded up the lower half of the windows with spare planks he kept in the loft, leaving only narrow slits for observation. He moved from one to the other, his rifle cradled in his arms, his breath steaming in the cooling air. He had let the fire die down to a dull glow to prevent their silhouettes from being cast against the walls, making them easy targets. Coda was a statue of tension in the center of the room. He didn't pace. He stood rigid, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, picking up sounds Elias couldn't hear, the crunch of a paw on snow, the brush of fur against bark. Every few minutes a low growl would rumble in Coda's chest, a seismic warning that traveled through the floorboards and into the soles of Elias's boots. "I know, boy," Elias whispered, his hand tightening on the walnut stock of the Winchester. "They're circling, testing the wind." Elias knew the biology of what was happening outside. This wasn't a hunt for food. Wolves rarely attacked humans for sustenance unless they were starving or rabid, and these animals moved with too much precision for either. This was a territorial purge. The Black Alpha, the leader of the intruders, had tracked Coda not to eat him, but to erase him. In the brutal calculus of the wild, a survivor from a rival pack was a genetic threat, a loose end that needed to be snipped, and Elias, by harboring the fugitive, had made himself an enemy of the pack. The first attack came at 2:00 a.m. It wasn't on the door, it was on the woodshed attached to the side of the cabin. The sound of tearing wood shattered the silence, claws ripping through the siding. They were trying to flush them out, to create a breach that would force Elias to open the door. "Smart," Elias hissed. "Too smart." He moved to the side window, peering through the slit. The moon had broken through the clouds, illuminating the snow in a stark, ghostly silver. He saw them, 5 of them, massive shapes moving like shadows made of muscle. They were timber wolves, easily 130 pounds each, their coats dark and matted with ice. They weren't attacking the shed blindly. They were digging at the foundation, trying to undermine the wall. Elias raised the rifle. He didn't want to kill. He had spent his life protecting these animals, but the equation had changed. He aimed for the snow just behind the largest of the shadows, a warning shot to scatter them. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. Outside, the snow exploded near the pack. The wolves scattered instantly, vanishing into the tree line with fluid, phantom-like speed. "That bought us an hour," Elias said, ejecting the spent casing. "Maybe 2. But he was wrong. They didn't wait an hour. They changed tactics. 10 minutes later, a heavy thud shook the front door. Then another. They were ramming it, not with their heads, but throwing their full body weight against the timber. The heavy oak held, but the hinges groaned in protest. Coda barked, a ferocious, deafening sound, and threw himself at the door, scratching at the wood as if he could tear through it and meet them head-on. "Coda, back!" Elias shouted, grabbing the wolf by the scruff. "You go out there, you're dead in seconds." Coda snapped at Elias, not out of aggression, but out of panic. He was desperate to defend his den. Elias looked into the wolf's eyes and saw the reflection of his own fear. They were trapped, and the door wouldn't hold forever. "We can't hide," Elias realized aloud. "They'll just burn us out or wait until we freeze." He made a decision. It was reckless, tactical suicide, but it was their only chance. He had to break their coordination. He had to take out the Alpha. If the leader fell, the pack structure would fracture and the subordinates would likely retreat. "I'm going out," Elias said, checking the magazine. "You stay. You hear me? Stay." He grabbed a flare gun from his emergency kit, shoving it into his belt. He took a deep breath, unbolted the door, and kicked it open. The wind hit him like a physical blow. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, the flare gun in his left hand. "Get back!" he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. The clearing seemed empty, but Elias knew better. He scanned the perimeter. There, standing at the edge of the trees, bathed in moonlight, was the Black Alpha. He was a monster of a wolf, scar tissue weaving through his jet-black fur, one eye clouded white from an old battle. He didn't flinch at Elias's shout. He stared with a cold, ancient intelligence. Elias raised the rifle to his shoulder. "Go," he warned. The Alpha threw his head back and let out a short, sharp bark. It was a signal. From beneath the porch, from the shadows of the woodpile, they erupted. 3 wolves moving so fast they were just blurs of teeth and fur. They hadn't retreated. They had set an ambush. Elias fired. The bullet took the lead wolf in the shoulder, spinning him around, but the momentum of the pack was unstoppable. The second wolf slammed into Elias's chest, knocking the wind out of him and sending the rifle flying into the snow. Elias hit the deck hard, his head cracking against the ice. The world spun. He saw jaws snapping inches from his face, smelled the hot, rancid breath of the predator. He raised his arm to protect his throat, feeling teeth sink into his heavy parka, bruising the bone beneath. He fumbled for the flare gun, but his hands were numb. "This is it," he thought, a strange clarity washing over him. "This is how it ends." Then a golden streak launched from the doorway. Coda hit the wolf on top of Elias like a cannonball. The impact was visceral, a collision of bone and fury. Coda, smaller and younger, drove the attacker back with a ferocity that defied physics. He wasn't fighting for territory. He wasn't fighting for status. He was fighting for his father. The attacker rolled, surprised by the assault, and scrambled back. But now the other 2 were on Coda. The Black Alpha, seeing the traitor, charged from the tree line, closing the distance in seconds. "No!" Elias screamed, scrambling to his knees. He saw Coda intercept the Alpha. It was a mismatch. The Alpha was nearly twice Coda's size. They collided in a flurry of snow and blood. The Alpha locked his jaws onto Coda's neck, shaking him violently. Coda yelped, a sound that tore through Elias's heart. But he didn't submit. He twisted, clawing at the Alpha's eyes, fighting with a desperation that only love can fuel. Elias crawled toward his rifle. It was 10 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. One of the subordinates, a gray female, saw him moving and lunged, snapping at his boots. Elias kicked out, his heavy boot connecting with her snout, buying him a second. He grabbed the rifle. The barrel was packed with snow. It was useless. He looked up. Coda was losing. The Alpha had him pinned, teeth seeking the jugular. Coda's struggles were getting weaker. The snow beneath them was turning red. Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate. He reverted to something primal, something pre-human. He grabbed the only weapon he had left, a heavy splitting maul that leaned against the porch railing. He charged. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He ran into the melee with silent, focused rage. He reached the Alpha and swung the maul, not with the intent to kill, but with the intent to break the world apart. The flat of the heavy iron head struck the Alpha's ribs with a sickening crunch. The Alpha released Coda, yelping in shock and pain, and scrambled sideways. He looked at Elias, this 2-legged creature who had entered the pack fight not with a boomstick, but with fang and claw of his own. Elias stood over Coda's prone body, the maul raised high, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm. He looked the Alpha in the eye and let out a roar, a sound that was torn from the deepest part of his soul, a sound of absolute unyielding defiance. "Mine," Elias bellowed. "He is mine." The Alpha hesitated. He was injured. His ribs were broken. But more importantly, he was confused. Predators calculate risk, and the risk here had just become infinite. The man was not prey, the man was a monster. The alpha chuffed, a sound of retreat. He turned and limped toward the trees. The subordinates, seeing their leader broken, faltered. They looked at Elias, then at the alpha, and the pack instinct to follow overrode the instinct to kill. One by one, they melted back into the shadows. Elias didn't move until the last of them was gone. He stood guard over his wolf, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving him shaking so hard he could barely hold the maul. He dropped the weapon and fell to his knees beside Coda. "Coda," he whispered, his hands hovering over the blood-soaked fur. "Coda, look at me." The wolf was a mess. His neck was torn, his ear was shredded, and his breathing was shallow and ragged, but his eyes were open. He looked up at Elias, and, incredibly, he tried to lift his head. He let out a soft whine and licked the blood from Elias's hand. "You idiot," Elias sobbed, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "You beautiful, stupid idiot." The next few hours were a blur of agony and medicine. Elias carried Coda inside, barricaded the door, and went to work. He didn't have anesthetic, he only had whiskey and grit. He poured the alcohol over the wounds, stitched the torn flesh of Coda's neck, while the wolf whimpered but held still, trusting the man who was hurting him to save him. When the sun finally rose, painting the snow outside in innocent hues of pink and gold, the battle was over. Coda was asleep, bandaged and heavily sedated with pain medication Elias had saved for himself. Elias sat on the floor, his back against the armchair, his own arm bandaged, watching the dust motes dance in the light. He looked at the wolf. He realized with a profound sense of peace that Sarah's promise had been kept. He hadn't just saved something, he had been saved. The wall he had built around his heart had been smashed down, not by a person, but by a creature who had run 42 kilometers on bleeding paws to find him. 1 year later, the Montana spring had arrived with a vengeance, turning the world into a riot of green and rushing water. The wild flowers were blooming in the meadows of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, painting the slopes in purple and yellow. On a ridge overlooking the valley, 2 figures sat side by side. Elias looked different. The heaviness was gone from his shoulders. His beard was trimmed, his eyes clear and bright. He held a notebook in his lap, sketching the flight path of a golden eagle soaring on the thermals below. Beside him sat Coda. He was magnificent. Fully grown now, he was a massive specimen of a timber wolf, his coat thick and lustrous. The scar on his neck was visible, a jagged line of white fur that stood out against the gray, a badge of honor. He sat with the regal calm of an alpha, for that is what he was, not the alpha of a pack of wolves, but the alpha of this strange 2-member tribe. Coda leaned against Elias's leg, a solid, warm weight. Elias reached down and scratched him behind the ears, right in the spot that made Coda's back leg twitch. "We should head back," Elias said, closing the notebook. "Stew's on." Coda looked up at him, tongue lolling out in a wolfish grin. He stood up, stretched, and then nudged Elias's hand with his nose. They walked down the trail together, man and wolf moving in perfect sync. They didn't need leashes or commands. They were connected by something far stronger, a bond forged in blood, sealed in snow, and tempered by the fire of survival. As they disappeared into the tree line, heading toward the column of smoke rising from their cabin, the wilderness seemed to whisper around them. It was no longer a place of indifferent cruelty, it was a home. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Thorne wasn't just surviving. He was living. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the incredible bonds that can exist between us and the natural world, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us share more stories of survival, loyalty, and love. Like this video, leave a comment telling us about the animal that changed your life. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're always part of our next adventure. Thank you for watching, and keep your heart wild.